we can look at, okay, can everybody still hear me? Okay, I just heard the recording in progress button. Okay, so if you look in the center, we have the IRP modeling, that's the constrained base. That was our original base run. And then radiating out from that, you have these different lines going to what we call our different groupings of sensitivities. Load forecasting scenarios up in the top left-hand corner, where we have our low forecasts, and then we have a low emerging tech, and then we have an RPS split scenario. Now, these two items are really additions that we were not originally modeling, but we have worked to provide those in response to stakeholder requests. Um, and as you go through these different bubbled areas, you can see how we think about comparing these. So these low forecast scenarios, you wouldn't necessarily compare to the market scenarios. They use a fundamentally different set of base load forecasts, which makes a comparative analysis very problematic between those different groupings. So it's really important to when you're grouping this information and making comparative looks at it, that you maintain comparisons between those different bubbles within a group. All right, and just some ideas on color coordination here. So green indicates a model run that has gone through both capacity expansion, where we allow them all to select new resources, and production costing, which is an hourly look through the entire 20-year planning horizon. So a green circle indicates capacity expansion and production costing runs, a full and complete model run. Now, if you see a color yellow, it means that it has gone through capacity expansion, but has not yet finalized its production costing run. And a pink color indicates a run that we have not completed yet. You're also going to notice that some of the circles are outlined in black and some are outlined in a thicker red band. The thicker red band indicates modeling runs that we will be reviewing in today's presentation. So I think that GridWorks is going to be providing a link to the mind map in the chat. So as we're going through the material and we're talking about a specific modeling run, you can reference back to the mind map to understand exactly what we're talking about and how it relates to all of the other scenarios in the presentation. Now, I'll pause there to see if anybody has any questions about the structure, and then I'm going to start describing exactly what each one of these different runs looks like.
Justin, can you describe for folks how this was modified, changes between this version and the version from the prior workshop, and things got to reflect the stakeholder requests that you mentioned earlier?
Thanks, Margie. So in response to all the stakeholder requests, all of these runs will now have 6 and 8 hour batteries available for selection there. So that's number one. The other changes are the additions of the low emerging tech and RPS split in the top left-hand corner. Those were runs that were not originally expected. Also, in the top right-hand corner, when you see the islanded use summer PRM, islanded use summer PRM for winter, that was a change that we did in response to stakeholders' requests, where we were debating on whether we drop a PRM requirement in the winter altogether, which was what SPS had originally done, or to modify the PRM to match the summer PRM requirement. And then what are we going to do with ELCC values? What ultimately was decided upon between us and stakeholders was that we would model the summer PRM annually. So throughout the entire year, it would maintain the same summer PRM requirement, but we would maintain the ELCC values that were, or the dynamic ELCC curves for winter and summer that we previously had. So that was the change that we did for the islanded use summer PRM for winter. Other changes in this, I think that really captures all of the other changes. We did, you do see that we have the what we call our split emerging tech scenarios, and these ones that have hydrogen CTs, geothermal, nuclear. Those are all force-in scenarios where we're taking the split RPS scenario and adding those technology types to them, and then allowing the model to re-optimize around those selections. All those have been previously identified, though. All right. Any other questions? And Kathy, thank you for adding that to the chat, a link to this screen. All right. So the slide deck that we'll be going through today is a very similar format that we've been providing previously. There's a couple different groupings of slides at the very beginning. We have what we call our nameplate edition slides. After that, we have an NPV comparison. That's where the net present value comparisons are between the different runs. And then we have a few additional slides before we get to our individual slide runs. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll start talking about our nameplate editions. So in this group of slides, we have three different groupings. This first one is specific to RPS, and then we'll talk about the islanded scenarios, and then we'll talk about the low forecast scenarios. What we're looking at on the screen, we've provided this similar structure before, but in case anybody's hasn't been following along with this material, what we have are the nameplate additions of generic resources through the entire 20-year planning horizon. And we group the first three graphics on different time ranges, and then the far right graphic is the total additions through the planning horizons. Now, what we're seeing here are just MRGC came on. Did you have a?
Yeah, you want to clarify the label on the axis? I think it's megawatts, not megawatt hours. Is that right?
Not. Oh, yep. On the y-axis, you're right. That should be megawatts, not megawatt hours. That appears to have been changed in another presentation. So I do know that we have made some updates within the last couple hours on the slide presentation material. We will provide an updated slide deck after the presentation today. All right. So what we have here are different groupings of our RPS scenarios. First, the amount of generic resources added by 2032. And then we have another grouping of resources that are added between 2033 and 2040, and then from 2041 to 47. To the right on the total additions, that's the cumulative total amount of resources by technology type that are added in these different scenarios. Now, if you have your mind map in hand, the base emerging tech is really the best comparison against all these technologies. That represents our resource buildouts on the planning forecast, and it allows emerging tech to be selected. So all of these different modeling runs allow for emerging tech. That's things like nuclear or hydrogen, long duration storage, things like that. And 6 and 8 hour batteries, like we previously discussed. So on the left-hand side, the by 2032 editions, you can see that they're regardless of what scenario we're talking about, we're really seeing a very similar build out between all runs. And just to remind folks, we're on this graphic, you see an RPS 2045, you see an RPS 2045 incremental, and RPS 2045 split. Now, RPS 2045 assumes the RPS constraint during the initial capacity expansion for New Mexico load. So this would be a build where we are requiring the state-specific requirement in SPS's system-wide build, which covers both Texas and New Mexico. It's still only the load ratio share for New Mexico, but it does influence the system-wide build out. Now, RPS 2045 incremental is a view where we take the base emerging tech and we treat the RPS requirement as a purely REC-driven requirement through the planning horizon and incrementally adds renewable resources to meet a 100% REC requirement at 2045. Now, the law is 100%, or I'm sorry, the law is 2045 carbon zero, but in this situation, we're treating RPS as a 100% REC requirement. Now, in the RPS 2045 scenario, which is the very far, in each graphic, it's the very far column, that is where we take the base emerging tech scenario and we look at the New Mexico thermal resources that were built and we remove them. and we allow the model to re-optimize with an RPS requirement that increases over time and not allowing the model to build incremental thermal generation. So it allows us to maintain uh, no impact to Texas from any state-specific requirement, but also build towards a future for New Mexico with increasing REC generation and no additional thermal generation. Now, through 2032, most all of these plans look very similar. You can see the one exception is that there seems to be a little bit of long duration storage in that base build 2045. However, as you move to the right, the scenarios start to look, they maintain a relatively similar build out. They all have long duration storage. They all have some indication of shorter 4-hour battery storage, solar, wind additions, and they do vary slightly on thermal resources, gas, CCs, and CTs. Now, to remind folks, we have modeled gas CCs and CTs because those are existing technologies today. Ultimately, though, all of our modeling indicates that resources with firm dispatchability that today look like gas are required through the entire 20-year planning horizon. So on these graphics, you're seeing this gas CC and gas CTs. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will be gas CTs and CCs. It means that we need a technology that has these same attributes to be able to maintain system reliability into the future. Now, as you get to further to the right, to 2041, 2047, you can see that there are still incremental thermal resources being built, but we start seeing larger additions of renewable resources. Now, those renewable resources on the RPS scenarios as compared to the base scenarios are really being driven by the RPS requirement in preparation for those 2045 requirements. So on the very far right, you can see that if you compare the base emerging tech to the 3 different RPS scenarios to the right, that is generally what you can expect that the RPS requirement is driving for New Mexico customers on a nameplate capacity build. Now, I will pause there, see if there's any general questions. We will be going through each one of these runs in much more detail, but I'll pause to see if there's any general questions right now.
Yeah, please raise your hand if you have a question for Justin at this point in the summary slide.
All right. Well, we will keep on moving through. All right, let's jump on to the next slide. So the next slide, we're talking about our islanded scenarios. So we really have 3 different build or portfolios that we can compare. What we call our base, and then we have our islanded scenario, which is a fully islanded approach, but it maintains the PRM requirements and ELCC values. The only difference is between the base and islanded is during the production costing run, the islanded scenario does not reconnect the market. So all of our capacity expansions turn the market off to build resources, but in the production costing stage, we generally turn the markets back on. In these islanded scenarios, we do not turn the markets back on. The other scenario you see here, islanded summer PRM for winter, the difference is between this one is that instead of having the currently 36% PRM in the winter, we drop that down to the 16% PRM and maintain it in a similar fashion with the summer requirements throughout the planning horizon. Ultimately, what you can see is that the build outs are generally the same. The islanded scenario with the summer PRM does produce slightly lower thermal resources in favor of more renewable and battery storage, but in general, the build outs are fairly similar. They do, however, have some pretty significant differences between the base and these islanded scenarios on expected unserved energy, which we'll discuss in a little bit. I'll pause there to see if anybody has if this brings up any questions for folks on the islander approaches that we modeled. All right. So jumping into the next slide, we have our low forecasts. And these scenarios were all performed based upon feedback from stakeholders. So we appreciate everybody's feedback and are happy to be able to provide this to you. So the low forecast, that just represents a base resource build out with our what we call our low forecast, well, our low forecast of future load growth. To the right, we have a low emerging tech scenario. So we're in the low base. We have not allowed emerging tech. In the middle one, low emerging tech, we do allow emerging tech. We consider those things like long duration storage, nuclear, um, hydrogen, things like that. In our low RPS 2045 split scenario, similar to what we provided in the previous slide, is a scenario where we were locking the resources for Texas on the thermals and removing the thermals for New Mexico and re-optimizing the model around additional renewables and non-carbon emitting resources. Now, for these scenarios, as we move through the planning or through the different time periods, you can see that there are still thermal generation being built in all scenarios. In RPS 2045 split scenarios, we do see additional resources being built. And as you get further to the right, you can see that the RPS on the very far right ultimately pulls in a little bit of long duration storage and does have a larger build out of non-carbon emitting resources such as batteries and wind and solar, and a slight reduction in thermal resources as compared to our base scenarios. So it's a very similar story that we were seeing in our planning forecast on general makeups, but it does represent a smaller overall build out than what the planning forecast was showing. Now, I'll pause there. Is there any questions about our general nameplate additions for the low forecast? Chris, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I really appreciate this. Question, this run that I'm looking at on the slide here does include the model option to select 6 and 8 hour batteries. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this shows that it did not select any 6 and 8 hour batteries, or is that just a function of the 4 hour storage, naming convention on the slide?
No, in all of our modeling runs, we never saw 6 and 8 hour batteries being selected over 4 hour batteries. The
Interesting.
model generally does select long duration storage on these RPS scenarios, though.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Justin, if I might, we're going to return to the islanded scenario. Previously, a question in the chat, just to ensure that stakeholder heard it correctly. Island does not turn markets back on. Is that correct?
That is correct. In these scenarios, this is just a modeling exercise where we disconnect the market and allow the model to dispatch on the production costing without the assumption of available capacity purchase, or not capacity, without available energy purchases or sales from the SPP market. Was
Thank
there
you.
a follow-up question to that?
I think just a clarification, but Curtis, I'll give you a chance. Anything further? Does that answer your question? Okay. Justin, I think we can keep going. I think that must do it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, now we'll jump into our NPV comparison slides before we start getting into a little bit more details about exactly or some of the more interesting things that we saw in some of the individual runs. Now, so for the summary NVP comparisons, it's the same order of slides. We'll talk about the RPS scenarios, then we'll talk about the islanded scenarios, and then we'll talk about the low forecast scenarios. So I will caveat that that the net present values here align with what our expectations are, but there are some very important things to discuss on the 2045 split related to how our modeling mechanisms work, and it relates to the SPS system. So we'll talk about that very soon. In general, you can see that RPS is costing between 600 million to 2.36 million or 2.36 billion more as compared to our base emerging tech scenarios. So there is an incremental cost for RPS. In general, that is in alignment with what we were expecting. However, there are some very important caveats with exactly the modeling approach for RPS split scenario, where we are removing New Mexico thermals and allowing Texas to continue to build thermals, and then re-optimizing around only allowing renewables and non-carbon emitting resources. We'll pause that conversation until we get to those slides, and we'll just run through these NPV values. But in general, do people have a question about what we are presenting here right now? Okay. And as we're going through these individual slide or these individual modeling runs, we'll talk about these. You can always revisit this slide material, kind of go back to see what those net present value deltas are and what is actually, what information can be gleaned from a deeper dive into individual modeling runs. So we'll jump into the islanded scenarios. This is a much simpler conversation. Can we get to the next slide, please? Seems like we're paused on this slide. There we go. Maybe had a connection interruption for a second. So, okay, so on our islanded scenarios, when we are islanding ourselves and still maintaining the PRM requirements that we currently have, both for summer and winter, and an associated seasonal ELCC, that is our bottom line here. And that one we're showing to be about $14 billion more expensive than our constrained base planning look. The scenario where we are removing the winter PRM and replacing it with the summer PRM requirement, but maintaining the ELCCs, that is actually resulting in a much higher delta on the net present value by 22, almost $23 billion. Now, most of that is being driven by expected unserved energy. So you can look down here at the bottom of the graphics, you can see that the EUE in our islanded summer scenario is driving about 18.3 million megawatt hours through the 20-year planning horizon. Now, the scenario where we are not adjusting the winter PRM, we see about 7.7 million megawatt hours. So that drives a significant delta on the net present values because of the penalty for expected unserved energy. Now, neither one of these scenarios are considered reliable. So when you are not building for a winter PRM requirement that is similar to what we are being provided from SPP, what we are seeing is that the resources being built aren't able to serve the needs of the load forecast that SPS is utilizing. So in general, like what would we do as a next step here? And the answer is we would incrementally increase the PRM requirement until we saw the EUE reduce down to what we are seeing in our base scenarios. So that would be the next step. So now that we have these bottom floors, what we could be doing is moving up that winter PRM requirement incrementally, 1%, 2% every run until we got to a similar amount of EUE that we are seeing in our constrained planning forecast. In this case, it's 0 megawatt hours. So this is an approach that kind of tells us that these base assumptions of maintaining the summer PRM is not sufficient, and that there needs to be a higher PRM requirement for winter as compared to summer to maintain system reliability. And I'll pause there, see if there's any questions.
Chelsea, I see you have a question. Please introduce yourself and your organization. I'm sorry, I forgot to ask Chris to do that same thing, but please let folks know who you are, and then we can check your audio at the same time.
Okay, thank you. This is Chelsea O'Tailing with Energy Futures Group. I just had a question. I haven't had a chance to look at the recently posted output files yet. Do you by chance know like if the EUV is happening near term, midterm, later in the planning period? Just was wondering about when it's emerging and the magnitude of when it starts to happen.
The last time I reviewed the files, I remember them being very consistent annually. So there was no near term or you know, like grouping of the data. It was generally seen throughout the entire planning horizon. But I can get back with you and check on that. In fact, let me see if I can just quickly pull up a file real quick and see. Just quickly glancing at it, it is a consistent thing that we are seeing in this in the EO files or the Encompass files. I am getting a note though that it is in the presentation. Oh yeah, I forgot. So we'll that's actually a really good segue. I'm so sorry that you review this presentation material and then you have somebody ask you a question specifically about it and then you just forget that you made a slide for it because you knew this question was coming. So I apologize.
Okay.
Let's jump to slide 16 real quick. So EUE for the island scenarios. So you can see here, there is a persistent throughout the years, but there are periods of time where it does have a peak. For the islanded scenario, where we are just maintaining our system PRM requirements and just turning off the markets, we see a near-term issue. If we are islanding and using a summer PRM for the winter, we're seeing a much more significant throughout the entire planning horizon. I'll pause there, Chelsea, if you want to look at that and have any questions.
Yeah, I guess so I think you referenced that you would, if I understood correctly, that you would potentially revisit this run to address the EUE by incrementally increasing the winter PRM. Did I understand that correctly?
I think that if we were going to continue this analysis, that would be what we would do. I'm not sure that we could actually commit to that right now as we're trying to get all the rest of the modeling completed. But what we're saying though is that that would be where I would take this next. Now, I do think though that 28 analysis for the SPB market is going to be much more robust and potentially allow us to adjust both PRM and ELCCs for the different seasons to figure out exactly where that makes more sense. I think that at this point, we should probably just pause this analysis, see where this is indicating. I think that we need to get these other runs out so that we can actually get the IRP out on schedule and rely on that 2028 analysis to go further. But I'd be interested in your thoughts, Chelsea.
No, I mean, I can definitely understand and appreciate all the modeling runs that you have to do. I guess would that mean that when it comes to filing the IRP, like you just would not include, I guess these would be kind of considered like preliminary or scenarios that you wouldn't move forward. Like, would you just not present those along with the scenarios that do get kind of across the finish line, I guess, so to speak, and don't have the EUE concerns?
I think we absolutely should consider putting this in the IRP document. I think that it is still instructive to understand that the winter does drive a reliability need that is different from just a summer PRM requirement. So I don't think that we would characterize it as that this is a portfolio that SPS could feasibly move forward with. But I think it's an important sensitivity and look about how these PRMs interact seasonally.
Yeah, I guess I think the only other comment I would just provide, and I don't know how to solve this because it's just it's happened to me in other jurisdictions where I've done modeling where you don't have EUV in the expansion plan, right? So the expansion plan doesn't know to solve for it, and then it pops up in your production cost run. But just looking at this big spike, especially for the island, summer PRM for winter in the early 2030s, and just thinking about some of the emerging tech assumptions, I'm just wondering if like the disconnect that happens between the capacity expansion and production cost modeling is missing the opportunity for the emerging tech options that are available for selection. So I do agree that you probably would take, if you do have the time, like take the steps to incrementally look at increasing the winter PRM. I'm just also wondering if that's like a missing piece here. And I understand you might not have the time to do the iteration for that, but that's kind of what this chart makes me wonder, especially if they're, even if they weren't available, or even if they were available for selection, Encompass might not pick them, right? Because it's not seeing the EUV and the expansion plan, right? So it doesn't know to solve for that. And so I'm just kind of wondering if there's a role here, if that's like a takeaway here from these results, is that there is a role for the emerging tech. But I understand there might not be time to go down that path. But thanks for entertaining my questions. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it. I think that there are ways to look at this problem, increasing PRM, looking at different types of emerging tech. I would say that like one of the reasons that the model is not seeing during capacity expansion, versus production costing is really that markets off and markets on approach. That the market does appear to have a reliability component to it, even though it is not necessarily considered a capacity resources that we would assign for RA purposes, but it does allow for an additional source of megawatt hours on the system. So I would say that utilizing or looking at the market as a resource is also a plausible way to understand this, that resource has a value for reliability that is not captured in capacity expansion because it doesn't have a capacity value for SPS system. Chelsea, any other comments or?
No, I mean, I totally agree with that. I kind of just had taken that like off to the side since these are focused on turning off the market. And if you potentially were in that scenario where you were involved with SPS, but I mean, I definitely agree with everything that you just said about the importance of the market.
Mm-hmm. All right. We want to move back up to slide 14 unless there's any more conversations about the island approaches in the EUE. All right. So on this slide here, we have the low forecast scenarios. We have a low base, and they have a low with emergent tech also being added. What we saw was, the same on the net present value between them. There might be some slight differences between those different build outs that are very small that are not being captured in the net present values that we're showing at this granularity. When you add RPS, you're seeing about a $90 million increase as compared to the low emerging tech scenarios. We'll caveat that with some more conversations about what's going on in these specific RPS scenarios in a second, though. But any questions on the low forecast? All right, Chelsea.
Chelsea, go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry, do I need to keep introducing myself?
I think you're okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Is the MPV the same because you're not getting a different expansion plan when you allow emerging tech to be available for selection?
I think there's a slight difference, but it's very, very small.
Okay.
And I think it might just be, within the MIP tolerances. I don't really think that I don't remember, let me see. Yeah, between our low and our low emerging tech scenarios, we didn't see any emerging techs being popping in, but there might be some differences just between different runs.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So with that, we've already had our conversation about the EUE comparison, so we can probably just move on to our capacity result slides. And this is where we'll start talking about individual scenarios. Um, Margie, I don't know, is this a good time for a break, or do we want to pause for questions, or how would you like to proceed?
So let's see if there's any questions. I do have one. Justin, can you talk about on the net present value analyses for all these scenarios? You know, in your mind, what is a significant result? Because some of those, you know, can you talk a little bit how you think about that those changes and whether they indicate something major happening there, or is it in the noise? I'm just curious your thoughts about the NPV changes on the two different slides that show NPV results.
It's a good question. Um, I'll what I will say is that the IRP always indicates, or the IRP rules are least cost portfolio to serve customers. Um, what we see is that some of these scenarios differ between a 20-year planning horizon on the net present value, in the single digit $1 million. Is that significant? Um, it's probably in the area of noise. I think that once you start getting to the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, those that starts to be significant. I will tell you, as we get to these larger build outs, they are also these are also they can be very tight differences between different scenario runs. And a lot of things can happen between those, especially when we're talking about the level of accuracy that the model is aiming for, the percentage of accuracy. So I would say that, in the tens, the hundreds of millions of dollars, that is significant. In the billions, is most assuredly is significant, so that's generally what I would say.
Great. Okay, thank you. And we do have a question from Curtis Miller on load forecast. And I think Curtis is having some technical difficulties. Curtis, by chance, can you enable your audio microphone and ask your question?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hey, this is Curtis with Western Farmers. You had brought up a load, and I know load plays an important role in this IRP. And I just wanted to follow up at SPP MOPSI last week. There was someone at the MOPSI that mentioned several gigs of load had possibly dropped out of the Permian Basin area. So I was wondering, in the future of the final IRP, will the load forecast reflect these changes?
I'm not sure I'm aware of the conversation that you're having. I wasn't at the MOPSI meeting. I don't know if Jared Cooley, if you are on and you'd like to discuss that at all.
Yeah, Justin, I can take that question. Thanks, Curtis. So the topic that came up last week at the MOPSI, sorry, Jared Cooley, SPS. The discussion that was alluded to at MOPSI had nothing to do with the Permian Basin. The discussion at the MOPSI was around data center loads that SPS had included in some of the future two models, and that SPS had been asking Southwest Power Pool to remove some of those loads from those future two economic models, so we weren't driving economic projects in area that we were not currently still seeing data center developments. And so the load within the SPS service territory, primarily around our oil and gas development in the Permian Basin, is remaining the same.
Okay, thanks, Jared.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the question, Curtis. Appreciate it. Chris Leger, and now we'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Margie. Yes, Chris Leger with the Interwest Energy Alliance. I'd just like to, I guess, go back to the discussion of the NPVs and put my thoughts on the table and just interested in your response. I think that for the most part, when it comes to utility IRPs throughout the country, least cost, least risk is the paradigm that a lot of these are analyzed under. And I think the least risk is difficult to analyze in terms of dollar values. But when I see NPVs that, let's say, for example, on the on the prior slide, I believe, had a approximately 5% difference. And what I see in that 5% difference, not that slide, I'm sorry, not this slide. Yes, thank you. The difference between the RPS highest cost, RPS incremental scenario, approximately 5%. And what you get out of that, from my perspective, is virtually eliminating or entirely eliminating fuel cost risk over the time horizon of this plan. And so I guess I would just really request that issues such as that, in terms of risk, are put into values that can be identified. And I also think identifying costs in terms of, millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, I think are difficult for me to really put in perspective. I think percentages are much easier for me to understand what are the puts and takes, what are the gives and takes that these different scenarios provide. So anyway, I don't know if that's a question, but I do think that the risk side of it is much more hard to value, but I think it's equally important.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. And can we pull up our slide 6 real quick, which goes back to our mind map? Yeah, that one right there. So I appreciate the comment, Chris. And what I would say is that there's a couple of things related. We do have gas price sensitivities. So I do hear you that, how impactful are gas price sensitivities to the net present value differences. We don't have those scenarios built out yet, but we will be providing results on that. But it does go towards you to answer. It goes towards your question about what is the risk associated with gas price sensitivities, and we try to make sure that all risks are really identified as an economic comparison. That's why we do have these scenarios. So it's maybe not all inclusive, but it is directionally, at least what we're trying to get after, is some understanding of like what risk is associated with tying yourself to gas price forecasts in the model. The other thing that I would like to mention is we do have some more conversation about the RPS scenarios. And yes, to your point, there's a cost delta associated on the net present value comparisons to understand the incremental cost of these different scenarios. I think it's important when we get to those individual runs to see exactly where those model runs end up, because I think there's an important conversation we should have there. So we'll get to that fairly soon. But thank you for your comments. Any other thing you would like to add, Chris, before we move on?
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right, let's jump back to slide 18. Oh, Margie, I forgot. Are we taking a break or not? I don't remember.
How are you doing?
I'm fine.
Okay, let's continue with this next piece, and then we'll plan to take a break after this next segment.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so the everything after slide 17, we're talking about some specific modeling runs. Generally, how we've had everything presented is we provide this graphical look of what the resource build outs are like, and comparing that to our PRM requirements and our load forecasting requirements, and then have some information on the right for the forecast assumptions that are associated with it, a general description, what the net present value, and any kind of specific things like EUE that are identified. On the graphic, more saturated colors represent existing resources on the system today, and less saturated, more faded colors are indications of generic future resources that are not real, but are where the model is saying we would build resources. So you can see like the dark red, that is a combined cycle that exists on the system today. The light pink color indicates CCs in the future. Dark brown indicates existing wind resources. A light brown indicates future generic wind resources. Generally how you should be reading this information. Now, this is our base build. And in this base build, we did not allow emerging tech in the scenarios. Now, if you jump to the next slide, you can see we did allow emerging tech. And when we allowed emerging tech, we ended up with a cheaper portfolio. And we also see the build change slightly and also include long duration storage. And that's that pink sliver at the top. So what we are indicating here is that there is a place for emerging tech on our system. And if it can be captured at the prices that we are indicating, then it would represent cost savings to customers on our system. Now, as we move forward on the RPS scenario, we utilize the base emerging tech as our base for comparison. So this was our cheapest portfolio on our base scenarios. We made our comparison to this scenario for all other runs. Now, we'll jump into our RPS 2045 scenarios here. So you can see slide 22. This is our RPS 2045, and you can see with the descriptions and or limits box over here, it says solves RPS compliance through optimization of resource additions across both New Mexico and Texas jurisdiction. What that means is that we did it in one capacity expansion where we add the New Mexico constraint and optimize the entire system. This scenario means that resources through the planning horizon are affected by one state, or I'm sorry, that the resources being built for one state's requirement affect both states. In general, we saw a small amount of EUE. We also saw, a delta increase on the net present value as compared to our base emerging tech scenario. Now, if we move to slide 23, you can see what the actual capacity differences are. So this is through at 2047, how do the total resource additions differ between our base emerging tech scenario and this one with the added RPS constraint? So you can see a significant amount of more wind, significant amount of more solar, additional amount of solar, and then you can see a reduction in gas CCs and CTs with the addition of 900 megawatts of long duration storage. Ultimately, this is a larger portfolio on the net present value, and it does remove thermal resources. Now, if we jump to the next couple slides, you can see we've generally provided these on all of our modeling runs in the past. We have a summer credit capacity look and a winter credit capacity look. It really helps once you have this material to kind of toggle between these two. You can kind of quickly see, what season is really driving resource development. In our case, it's winter, even though we are summer peaking utility. And the way you can tell that is that the lines, the top line that you see is much closer to the peak of the total resources on a credit capacity basis. Now in the summer, you're going to see a larger or taller amount of resources above the PRM requirement line. So we are building resources for winter, and it provides a slight overbuild of resources in summer. Now we'll jump to our RPS 2045 incremental look. Now this is taking our base emerging tech scenario and just incrementally increasing it, treating the RPS as a REC requirement only. So as we are moving through time, we increase the requirement from 50% to 80% in 2040 to 100% in 2045. And when we do that, we are not seeing, we're not allowing the base emerging tech to remove any resources. So all resources in this are just more resources than what the base emerging tech is. So obviously it's going to be a higher net present value. You're also going to see a very significant build out in 2045. And Curtis, I just saw you have a question, so I'll pause in a second. In 2045, you'll see a significant build out of resources to transition to that 100% requirement. And I will pause there, Chris, I think, or not Chris, I'm sorry. Chris, you're still on my screen right now. So Curtis, you have a question. Do the cost assumptions for the new generic gas combined cycle resources include carbon capture and storage? They do not. We did not include carbon capture and storage on our CCs in any of our model runs. Curtis, did you have any follow-up conversation you'd like to have on that?
Uh, no, I just know that the carbon capture adds a lot of cost. So I didn't know if it was building it out because of that or if it was just regular, no, running SCRs or emission type stuff.
Thanks for the comment, Curtis. In general, where we are considering carbon capture is that it is not an ETA compliant resource. There still is carbon emissions associated with carbon capture. So although it would provide significant carbon reductions, it is not a carbon zero resource. All right, so next slide, 28, you can just see that this is an incremental build. There's no resources that are being reduced. This is just incrementally increasing resources to get to that 100% REC requirement, although that's not what the law says. All right, and we move to the next slides. We have our summer accredited capacity and our winter accredited capacity. As this is incremental, if we move our winter accredited capacity slides, you're going to see that the winter accredited capacity is actually an overbuild because we're not building resources to meet a capacity requirement. We are doing it to meet an RPS requirement incrementally over our base capacity needs. I'll pause there, see if there's any questions about this scenario.
Yeah,
Yes,
Darren, please go ahead, introduce yourself and go ahead with your question, please, Darren.
Yeah, Justin, Darren Zigich, New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. What is the purpose of this run? I mean, because it's not 100, there is no 100% renewable requirement. So I'm not clear as to why we're running this. It seems confusing, or it's confusing me anyways.
Understood. And we looked at how to model RPS in a lot of different ways. We're trying to get an average of different types of model runs to understand how they differ. So what are the different impacts of slight tweaks to the model or understanding, and how different are the capacity buildouts overall? So I definitely agree with you. We are not looking at this scenario or the other scenario, the one we previously talked about, where RPS 2045, because the last scenario would be one state's policies affecting a different state's policies. So neither one of these scenarios are ones that would move forward, but they are different views of how we were looking at about how to model this. So they should really just be looked at as modeling exercises.
Okay.
Any other thoughts, Darren, or ready to move on?
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions about that scenario? All right. So now we get to our RPS 2045 split. And this is how we are really envisioning our modeling approach to getting to the 2045 requirement. This is our preferred approach on how we did this. It has some limitations, and we'll discuss those. So in this scenario, we are locking the Texas load ratio shares of the thermal resources, and the New Mexico thermal resources we remove. And when we do that, we re-optimize, allowing only renewables and non-carbon emitting resources. It includes the RPS requirement to 50% to 80%, and then at 2045, we are also considering this 100% REC requirement, but we are not allowing additional thermal resources. So the idea here is that we are trying to maintain the impacts from state-specific policies to each individual jurisdiction while still maintaining the indirection, which is no more thermal resources for New Mexico, and getting to the 100% carbon zero requirement. So it's a two-step approach, only adding renewables or non-carbon emitting resources and including the RPS constraints. Now, when we move on to the next slide, I feel like this is probably the most informative about what is actually the difference here. Base emerging tech, we start out here, we add a lot of wind, we add solar, very similar kind of build outs that we were talking about before, 4-hour batteries, long duration storage, and then the reductions of gas and CCs and CTs for an incrementally larger build. Now, the same situation kind of exists that we talked about previously, where if you look at the winter accredited capacity, you're going to see a larger amount of resources than what the PRM would indicate would be required, partly because you're building resources to help meet the RPS requirements in addition to the PRM. So the PRM no longer becomes the sole constraint on what is driving resource build. It is the RPS and ETA compliance. Now, let's get into a little bit of the nuance of this modeling scenario. We'll jump on to the next slide. Now, this is a similar slide that we had provided in one of our Texas IRP meetings. We are a multi-jurisdictional system. We've been utilizing this process, the IRP process, and adding some of our Texas communities into the process. This is one of the slides that we presented there, and I think this is a good addition and kind of good understanding of what these RPS runs are looking at. Now, we are obviously operating across both Texas and New Mexico. In Texas, the planning is governed by least cost planning, maintain reliability, competitive bidding processes, very similar to New Mexico's. New Mexico's planning is governed with those same requirements, and in addition, the ETA and renewable portfolio standard, which pushes towards carbon-free generation resources. Now, this is a difficult problem to solve, and SPS is taking a multi-step solution to solving the situation. We generally kind of consider it 5 steps, where we have a base plan of generic resources. It's developed to meet both Texas and New Mexico. That's our base and emerging tech scenarios that we had. That's consistent with the Texas and New Mexico policy for least cost, maintaining reliability, competitive bidding. Now, when we move on to the next step, we review the resources that are in the base plan, and we take those New Mexico load ratio of carbon emitting resources and remove them while locking in the other resources of the base plan. And then once those are removed, we allow them all to re-expand with no non-carbon emitting resources, and a 2045 goal is modeled as a 100% REC requirement. Now, to your point, Darren, earlier, the law is not 100% REC generation. The law is 100% carbon free. The reason that we are modeling it this way is if we take New Mexico and we're building incrementally towards New Mexico's compliance, if we are not allowing thermal resources to be built and we are requiring only resources to be built to be carbon-free emitting, or I'm sorry, non-carbon emitting resources or renewables, it should get you to the same directional place. And once we've done that, we take the incremental cost between those steps 1 and 3 and attribute 100% to New Mexico for the ETA compliance. And then the Texas customers in the next step are assigned the load ratio share of their resources from step 1. Now, let's move on to slide 37.
So before you move on, let's see if there are any questions about this process. This is a really important concept for our stakeholders to understand. So let's take some questions if there are any here. Go ahead, Darren.
Well, I'll just ask the obvious one, Justin. So then who eats New Mexico's share of the thermal resources?
Nobody does. They're removed.
Well, you can't split a turbine in half, and I mean, who? You know what I'm getting at. I mean, is this a viable? I guess I'm just trying to figure out if this is a viable scenario.
I understand, and this is a modeling approach, and so when we have scenarios where there would be a partial resource, we round. So there are no partial thermal resources that are getting cut in half. But your point's taken that, I mean, if can you really split a CT? No, you can't. what we're trying to make sure that we're rounding those to whole units so that we can model this. Now, these are generic resources. There's going to be some level of rounding that would have to happen because of that. But directionally, I think it's a sound approach. Is there any more, Darren, you'd like to discuss?
No, I think that, I guess that covers it. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Appreciate the comment. All right. Any other questions about our approach here? All right. Margie, you think we're good to move on to the next one? Okay. All right. So where does this modeling approach get us to? On this graphic, you're going to see a gray, a red, and a hatched red color. The gray indicates Texas emissions. The red indicates New Mexico emissions. If you include the red hatched area, that would be the base emerging tech scenario. So that's the least cost scenario. Um, that's where emissions are. The red hatched area is when we've removed the New Mexico thermal resources and reinforced the RPS constraint. That becomes the avoided emissions by including the RPS constraint. Now, what we are indicating here is that this modeling approach, although we are not allowing any additional carbon resources on the system to serve serve New Mexico on a load ratio share, we still see that you can contribute or that you can attribute around 2 million pounds of CO2 emissions past 2045 annually. Now, why is that? SPS is a multi-jurisdictional system. It's not uh, it doesn't have a clear break between the Texas and New Mexico on the transmission system. And so what we are seeing in the model is a reliance. The units on the y-axis are pounds. So what we are seeing I'm sorry, the question was, I forget about the recording. The question was, what are the units on the y-axis? The y-axis is pounds of CO2 emissions. So what we are seeing is that after you get to 2045, there is a reliance on the Texas thermals. So although we are not allowing thermals to be built on a load ratio share, the model is building enough resources to be able to solve its capacity requirement for New Mexico and build enough renewable energy to, on a volumetric basis, supply enough RECs to the system to meet New Mexico's load ratio share. Now, the problem becomes on the hourly basis. And every hour throughout the entire 20-year planning horizon, what we're seeing is that you're not necessarily able to attach a megawatt hour that's generated on the system to either one of the states. So the Texas thermals do help support the 100% REC requirement and avoids the additional resources on a capacity basis. Ultimately, this approach does significantly reduce New Mexico emissions. In fact, it's an 84% reduction as compared to 2005 levels, even though the system is growing today by 2.5 times. Now, what we are seeing past 2045 annually is that the remaining level of emissions is approximately a Gaines County amount. And Gaines County is a 5 CT unit, 5 CT unit that is being proposed, that was proposed in our 2024 RFP. So that's about like the amount of emissions that you would expect annually from about 1,000 megawatts of CTs operating about a 35 to 40% capacity factor. Now, we have some next steps. I'd like to get through those, and then we can come back to this for some questions, if that's okay. Okay. So let's jump to slide 38. All right. So what we are currently seeing is in this scenario where we are not allowing additional thermal resources to be built for New Mexico's load ratio share is that the split scenario is an incremental cost of around $600 million through 2047 and contains around 2 million tons of CO2 emissions. Now, the CO2 emissions are a result of thermal resources dispatching to fulfill the hourly load obligation through the planning horizon. That means that the model portfolio doesn't contain enough non-carbon emitting firm dispatchable resources to offset the reliance on thermal generation not assigned to New Mexico to serve New Mexico load. What we are thinking of that would be next step is to model the cost of lowering the 2045 New Mexico attributable emissions further. We would increase the PRM requirement and allow the model to only expand on non-carbon emitting resources. That would drive additional capacity and energy resources to solve the New Mexico and to drive carbon emissions down, but it is not necessarily going to immediately root out all carbon emissions. So we can continue to increase that PRM requirement and require the model to build more renewable and non-carbon emitting resources to drive the emissions down. We have done some previous analysis that's similar. And so in the 24 RFP, since what we are looking at right now is about a Gaines County facility operating at a 35 to 40% capacity factor, that's very similar to what we modeled in the 24 RFP, where we tried to remove that thermal resource, that Gaines County, and allow the model to reoptimize and only allowed it to replace it with carbon free resources. And what we saw was about a $5.5 billion increase in the net present value. And it increased the nameplate additions of both solar and wind and notably best resources. Now, that's ultimately where we think that this modeling would go if we start increasing the PRM to drive additional resources. Now, this is only a modeling approach, and although we are indicating that there's CO2 emissions associated with this, this really indicates that there's firm dispatchable needs on the system today. And given today's current technology, it looks like gas CTs and combined cycles. In the future, if there are non-carbon emitting firm capacity resources that ultimately become a lower cost solution, this could be a different narrative here. However, with our modeling approaches that we have today, these are carbon emitting resources, and this is what we've been modeling. So I will bring it back to slide 37 and see if we have any questions or thoughts on this.
Chelsea, yes, please go ahead.
Thanks. I realize that I have never asked this question before, so I don't understand the approach that you're taking. But when in that purple box, when you say while growing New Mexico load by 2.5 times, for any of the large load in your load forecast where it's an unknown entity, right? You don't know what jurisdiction it's going to go to. Are you assuming half of that load is going to New Mexico and half of that load is going to Texas for purposes of this calculation?
So our load forecast is split jurisdictionally by Texas and New Mexico. So through our hourly forecast, we do have a forecasted Texas and New Mexico load. Does that answer your question, Chelsea?
I guess I'm not understanding. So would that mean that your ratio is connected to your historical? I'm just wondering, like, when you factor in the large loads that you don't know from the probabilistic model, like you don't know where they're going to go, like how do you incorporate that into this and for the New Mexico and Texas split?
Well, I'm not the load forecasting expert. We can get John to answer some more questions if you'd like, but we do model both Texas and New Mexico load growth. So I'm not like, I think it's a matter of like where the forecasting is, what granularity the forecast is at, and we do have a statewide forecast that's combined for a system forecast. Does that make sense, or should we get John? I don't know if he's on the call, but we can probably.
Okay, John,
I
yeah, he's
I
on the
can jump
call.
in real quick, but I'm also catching up. So, Justin, this is the planning forecast as we sent it to you, right? Is that what you're running through this scenario?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, good question. So, for the probabilistic load, we do allocate that to the states, and we allocate it based on the known large load inclusions. So, for example, if 75% of the known large load inclusions are going to New Mexico, 75% of the probabilistic load will also go to New Mexico, and by industry as well. So data centers and oil and gas. That's how we disaggregate that kind of clump of probabilistic load that we model.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
And
Thanks, John, for jumping in.
great, thank you. Anything else on that load before we go to Chris Leger has his hand up? Is anything else on Chelsea? You satisfied with that understanding?
Yep, that answered my question. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you. All right, Chris Leger, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So my understanding of this scenario is to determine what it takes to comply with New Mexico law. And my understanding of this slide that we're looking right now here is that it does not comply with New Mexico law. Is that a correct understanding?
This guy called and he has 5 acres.
Sorry about that, Chris. So what I would say is that we are modeling the system on a system-wide basis. So it includes both Texas and New Mexico customers. And we've looked at other ways to model this. And I'm not saying that we have settled on a final path forward on modeling. But what I would say is that there's a number of renewable resources or resources that are in both states. And for instance, we can look at a hail wind farm, which is in Texas. And if we are looking at how do we figure out if New Mexico, every single hour of the A760 can be free of carbon, it's very difficult to be able to model that between two states with intermingling transmission systems. Now, our approach that we took was to look at it on a system-wide basis and make sure that the resource build to service our Texas customers was compliant with their approaches. We also wanted to make sure that it was compliant with New Mexico approaches. And by maintaining, by removing the New Mexico thermal resources from the base emerging tech and only allowing future resource development to be non-carbon emitting, the approach, if it was not a pool of resources across a multi-jurisdictional system, would get you to carbon zero. And all resources that are being added when we add the carbon constraint are carbon free. So all incremental resources to service New Mexico load are carbon zero in the scenario. What we are saying is that the system still has carbon emissions associated with it because it is connected to a system that does have thermal generation on it and carbon emissions. The same thing as with the SPP market. It does have carbon emissions in the SPP market. The only way to not have carbon emissions for New Mexico customers from a market that does include that would be to separate it. Chris, I don't know if that was a long-winded answer, but I don't know if you had any more thoughts or questions on it.
I do, but I don't think right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
But Justin, isn't your next slide where you talk about doing a different modeling approach, isn't that attempting to get to the goal that Chris is describing?
I think that those are next steps. We actually have kicked off sensitivities, and one of the very first sensitivities that we've kicked off was let's just increase the PRM by double for when we add this New Mexico RPS constraint on there, and allow them all to re-optimize around that. So the Texas portion would stay locked, and then we re-optimize the New Mexico side with a higher PRM. So it's going to have to build more resources, and those resources would be non-carbon emitting. And the idea would be that there would be more capacity and energy resources to serve every single hour of the year. Now, will it get us to carbon zero on our modeling approach? I don't know that yet. We haven't seen the results of that sensitivity, but that's what we're looking at right now.
Okay. Okay. Great.
I see another hand up.
Yeah, Alex, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Palomino with Energy Strategies. Um, Justin, this is a tricky, tricky web to untangle, and I'm trying to understand what the hopes are. So, looking at this Gaines County as an example, are you guys are attributing some of that Gaines County generation, so that's a thermal resource, some of that generation in Texas, you're sort of counting it against the New Mexico ETA by way of load share or imports or hourly difference in net load between the two sides of the system? Like, how are you attributing the emissions in Gaines County from Gaines County onto the New Mexico against the New Mexico ETA?
So the reference to Gaines County in this uh, purple square right here is only to give folks an indication of the volume of of emissions. There's no actual attributing of the Gaines County emissions in this run towards New Mexico. We're just giving people a general idea of, hey, this amount of emissions, this is what it looks like. It looks like 1,000 megawatts of CTs operating at a 35 to 40% capacity factor.
Oh, I see.
And the reason we made that reference is that on the next slide, the 24 RFP included Gaines County, and we did scenarios where we removed Gaines County and allowed it to re-optimize to replace Gaines County. So it's really answering two separate questions. The first question is how to get to carbon zero. And we're saying that this current portfolio is still showing some amount of emissions. Those emissions are similar to what a facility like this looks like. And when we did a sensitivity for removing a resource like that, this is what our net present value difference was. It was a $5.5 billion cost. So they're related scenarios that we have performed on analysis, but they are not a one-for-one comparison.
So the red on the previous slide that reflected New Mexico emissions after with the benefit of the RPS, those are reflective of and I'm sorry if this is a dumb question. Those are reflective of existing thermal resources that have to stay online in New Mexico. Like they're attributed to generators inside of New Mexico.
No, no. What that red indicates, especially like towards the end of the x-axis here through 2045, is that the thermal resources that are on the system, not necessarily physically placed in New Mexico, but they could be in Texas, are ultimately dispatching at a level that's greater than Texas load ratio share, which means it would be attributable to New Mexico's load.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Okay, good discussion. Justin, are you at a good point for us to take a 10-minute break?
I can take a break.
Okay. Because I think the next piece we're going to is on the islanded results, right? Okay. Let's do that. Let's give everybody a chance to catch their breath. It's 2:34 p.m. Mountain Time. So let's resume our conversation at 2:44, a 10-minute break to stretch, grab a drink, regroup, decide what other questions you'd like to have before we continue. So let's take a 10-minute break at this point and resume at 2:44.
RJ, I can't remember if you said 343 or 345.
Sorry, we said at 44 past the hour, so
Oh.
we got another minute.
Do you want me to go ahead and start, or you want to give us a second longer?
Let's just wait just one more minute. Thank you. All right, hopefully everyone had a chance to get a drink of water, a cup of tea, or something to keep us sustained for the next bit. And we'd like to go back to Justin Gable and continue our conversation about model results. Justin, please proceed.
All right. I do want to just jump back to our slide 37 for just one other second longer. And I was just going to tell you, I went to go get a tea, and the water's out in our building, so I didn't get one.
Oh, oh.
Okay, so the just a couple of things I wanted to highlight here.
Windy.
I think that somebody might need me mute. Is in this scenario, we are indicating like this is an incremental cost increase, but it does make significant improvements and reductions in overall carbon emissions. That RPS constraint makes a significant reduction. It's an 84% reduction on carbon at a not an insignificant incremental cost, but not in the billions of dollars to get to this. Now, that last 2 million pounds of CO2, that does have significant escalation on cost. That's why we were highlighting that comparison to that previous gains analysis of about $5 billion. Now, we want to do more analysis, but directionally, when we removed a facility like that had that kind of emissions, that's what it took to do it. I also wanted to just real quick jump back to our nameplate slides. And on slide 8, this is our nameplate additions. So those are those RPS scenarios that we're looking at. And the ones that we've been talking about, when we had most of our conversation was focused on that RPS split scenario on the far right. Now, what I would like to show folks is that, this, we're not foregoing progress towards RPS, or we're not necessarily considering RPS as a 100% requirement in 2045. The resource selections and targets are, much earlier that would be RFPs resulting from this IRP. Future IRPs will continue to look at this situation, this scenario, and there's opportunity to move forward in both our RPS 2045 split scenario and our base emerging tech that are very similar looks right now. So progress towards the RPS 45 requirement is well within what our expectations are for future RFPs related to this IRP. So I just want to make sure that folks were keeping that in mind, that all of our scenarios indicate a very similar build out that do make progress towards the RPS 45 requirement, and that we are not precluding ourselves from future technologies that might ultimately get us a lower carbon requirement or potentially carbon free in 2045. So, all right, we'll jump back over the island scenario unless anybody has any further thoughts on the RPS scenarios before we go. All right. Okay.
And so, Justin, let me, as you're switching to island, let me review our conversation at the last workshop. There was strong stakeholder interest in this, both the base and the low load forecast run through the RPS requirements scenarios. And so let me pause and ask, especially those who were interested in that being added to the modeling scenario list, to offer any comments that they have about whether this met the interest that they had in this particular topic, or was there something missing? Let's just ask if anybody wants to comment, especially those who had a strong request for looking at these alternative RPS focused scenarios. Any additional thoughts, reactions? Okay, Justin, I just wanted to give a chance for those, since it was a really rich discussion that we had in Hobbs, and to want to make sure that we're following the intent that stakeholders had in mind.
All right. Okay, now we'll move on to the islanded approach. So now, in these islanded approaches, you can see that we maintain the planning forecast that we were using in the other base scenarios. The difference being that when we moved to production costing, that there was no market available for purchases or sales. So in our islanded scenario, we're showing on the screen, the capacity expansion build out is exactly the same. So the only thing different here is the availability of the market during production costing runs. And what we saw was about 7 million megawatt hours of EUE that drives an increase on the net present value. So that's not much to show on this capacity expansion. Obviously, if you move to the next slide, further indication there was no change to the capacity build out. Now we'll move on to slide 44, which is our islanded summer PRM for winter. So go to the next one, and we can see that there is a change in capacity build out. I'll let folks toggle back and forth between scenarios so they can kind of see some incremental differences on the build outs throughout the years. But if you jump to slide 46, you can see the total capacity resource difference, or I'm sorry, capacity difference between our base scenario and our scenario where we are building for a summer PRM requirement during winter, but maintaining the winter ELCCs that we have. In that scenario, you can see that we add a little bit more wind, but the model reduces the amount of solar and 4-hour batteries and gas CTs. With the reduction of these resources, the islanded summer PRM in winter scenario is a lower nameplate megawatt build than the base scenario, but it has a higher NPV that is substantially driven by the EUE in the model. So this scenario, although it reduces the amount of resources, is more expensive because it is less reliable of a portfolio than what our base scenario is with the removal of these resources. I think we had a pretty good conversation about this one a little bit earlier, so I don't know if there's any other thoughts or questions. All right, we can jump into our low forecasting scenarios. All right, so this is our low base forecast. So this was the exact same approach that we took in our regular planning forecast scenario. We did not allow emerging tech in this scenario, but we did allow 6 and 8 hour batteries. So this was our base scenario for our low forecast. So this is where we make all of our comparisons. Now we'll just quickly toggle through the next couple of slides, just real quick. You can see the summer credit capacity basis and the winter credit capacity basis. You can see it's the exact same situation that was happening with our other planning forecast, where we are building for a summer requirement, or I'm sorry, a winter requirement, and it's slightly overbuilding the resources if you were just to purely look at a summer need. Now, in general, though, what we are seeing the low forecast as compared to the regular planning forecast is a good distribution of different resource types across the system. So it's not necessarily looking at avoiding any thermal generation or avoiding any solar. It's a very well-rounded mix of resource types in our low forecast scenarios. Now, if we jump to slide 54 and 55, we take this exact same scenario and we allow emerging tech to be available for selection. Now you can see though that no emerging tech was selected. Now, if we move to the next slide, I think that there was a question earlier. I feel like we've had this a little bit of this conversation already. Is that basically the resource portfolios when we allow emerging tech to come in are exactly the same. It's maybe making some slight differences that can really just be a function of individual modeling runs and not necessarily indicative of any major changes here. So because of that, we won't jump into the accredited capacity slides. Not much to talk about on there. But we can talk about the low RPS 2045 split. So similar to our previous conversations where we had the RPS 2045 split for the planning forecast, we did it for the low planning forecast. What we are seeing, if we go to slide 61, is that the resources generally build more wind, more solar, and reduce the gas in the portfolio, and also add long duration storage. So although the numbers change between our planning forecast and our low planning forecast, the general resource types and volumes are similar. We see a significant build out of wind, a smaller build out of solar, reduction of the gas, and then a minor share of both short duration and long duration storage technologies to meet the RPS scenario on a low forecast basis. And that kind of ends our presentation material today. So we can leave it open for some conversation today.
Yeah, while we're opening up to questions, Justin, can you remind the stakeholders what the low forecast scenario really looks like compared to the your base, constrained planning? Just in general terms, so people understand, because this was a big conversation at the last workshop of running a low load forecast through these RPS scenarios. Can you remind the group how different the low load forecast is from the next one up?
I might ask John Goodenough to maybe give us a recap of the differences between the forecasts. Would you mind, John? Did he step away?
No, I'm here.
Okay, well maybe if he comes back, I don't know if all our stakeholders recall the difference. That's why
I think John came off mute.
John, would you like to add any commentary about the difference in the low load forecast versus the base load forecast?
Yeah, and I'll do my best to remember all of the differences right here on the spot. But the main difference is the inclusion of the probabilistic load in the planning forecast. So that kind of gives us load above and beyond kind of our known requests and highly probable requests.
Great, thank you. Questions from anyone on material that Justin and John and team have shared today?
Just to remind folks, we did add to iManage the inputs and output files for all the runs that are included in this presentation. We are continuing to work through all the other scenarios for our early August meeting, and we'll be adding more inputs and output files as they become available. So yeah, if you have an opportunity, please go check it out. Still not too late, I think, to sign up for a confidentiality agreement if you want to dive into the modeling details.
Justin, maybe you can go back to the mind map and just kind of give a synopsis of what your next steps are from the modeling team's perspective, and any insights you want to share from those ovals that are in red that you presented today. Just kind of your general sense of what you've gained in insights and what your next steps might be.
Okay. Yes. So, a number of these runs that are shown as pink or yellow or even green without a red circle around it, we took a deliberate focus to make sure that we could complete runs for this presentation. In fact, we had runs running all the way up until this morning to get ready for this presentation. So we put everything else that is pink to the side so that we could be responsive to this meeting. Now that we've got through this, we will be pivoting and completing the rest of these runs. We do have these data center runs that have completed, but we have not had the opportunity to really take a deep dive to understand and QA/QC those presentation materials. So we plan to talk about that next time. Also, the gas sensitivity ones. In general, for the gas price sensitivity, the existing resource changes, data centers, those scenarios, we're not expecting any major issues or impacts to modeling. What we have seen is that on our split emerging tech scenarios where we are forcing in these different technology types that were not being natively selected, is modeling runtimes have significantly increased, especially with the inclusion of the 6 and 8 hour batteries. That was a surprisingly impactful um, uh, uh, addition to our runtimes by including that. And as we continue to add more and more complexity to the model with these force ins, we're also seeing runtimes increase. And every time a model run time increases, and if we find an error, it does really cause us to restart the entire process. So it can be a lengthy iterative process to get some of these modeling results. But at this point, I feel like we've got a pretty solid process on getting these completed. So we should be ready to go for August 5th. It is August 5th, right?
Right. Yeah. So you can look forward to hearing more. And before we do a summary and next steps, Justin, would it work for you all if people are reviewing this today or looking at the slide deck over the next several days, would you be willing to take questions that we could then bring back to closure on August 5th on any of the material that's been presented today? Just I mean, it's not like you're going to rerun models, but if people have questions about the results and such, should we encourage people to send questions to Linda Hudgens and to Deb Shields so that they can at least be on the list of anything that needs to be wrapped up when we talk on the 5th?
Yes, I encourage it. I mean, if I know this is a lot of material, it's a very complicated system, and we're doing our best to distill it down, but we're going through a lot of material. So if questions or concerns come up, please feel free to send us an email. We will be more than happy to write either a written response or at least provide some presentation material for the August 5th meeting to be responsive.
Great. Let's give just another few minutes if people do have questions from today's material before I turn to Kathy for anything that's on chat that we need to address, and then we'll summarize and do next steps. But first, stakeholders, if you have questions, please raise your hand or put in chat at this point. We'd love to hear any other concerns, questions that you would like to pose at this point. Go ahead, Alex, please.
Hey, good afternoon. I'll just take advantage of some of the quiet time and ask for retreading of probably old ground, but maybe Justin or John Goodenough, could you remind us what the probabilistic data center method was for developing the load forecasts?
You see if John's still on.
I don't see John on the call at this point.
Yeah, sorry, Alex. We can definitely, if you have any specific questions you want to write to us, and we'll be more than happy to take that back and give you a response back. We did have some pretty extensive conversations. I'd encourage you, please, go back to the GridWorks website and check out the other presentation material. But yeah, if you're not finding any answers, more than happy to talk with you about it, through email, or we can set up another call if we need to.
Yeah, sounds good.
Alex, we'll take that as a follow-up and try to direct you to materials that might answer that question for you. And we'll put that on our follow-up action list.
Thanks, Margie.
Sure. Anything else from folks? Kathy, are you seeing anything else either on chat or in your mind that we need to address before we do our summary?
Yeah, thanks, Margie. Justin, just a little bit of a refresh. I think I see several names that maybe haven't been present earlier. Can you remind us the time frame? We spent a lot of time on 2047 and beyond emissions, but your planning horizon, and correct me if I'm wrong, 2027 to 2047. The action plan that's called for in the rule, we're looking at 2027 to 2029. And then resources that might come out of this, is there sort of a window that you think that an RFP might have resources coming online?
Yes, thanks for the question, Kathy. Yeah, so we've been thinking about that internally. There's a couple of um, developments with our 25 RFP. I think folks on this call know that we are completing an evaluation for our 25 RFP, that those results of that portfolio selection would need to be incorporated with this when we identify our ultimate need. I think that RFP might influence a little bit of what that resource acquisition period is. In general, at this moment, what I would just say is like 2030 to 35, 36, somewhere in there is really the period of time that we'd be looking for resource acquisitions in our statement of need. The subject to change, we still haven't drafted the statement of need yet. We're still looking through all the modeling results. Like I said, a lot of this modeling results is fresh off the press as of this morning. So we'll be looking to see exactly how that 25 RFP and all of these modeling results kind of meld together to ultimately identify that statement of need.
Great, thank you. And then Margie, to your second question, chat is clear and I don't see any other hands up.
Okay. Great. So let's, Deborah, would you mind sharing our final slide in our deck, please? So we've dug deep into modeling details so far today. Our workshop summary from today will be posted on our website and distributed in a few days. If you have questions that are still lingering or that you would like to have be considered before or during the August 5th modeling results session, please send them to Deborah Shields at gridroots.org and to Linda Hudgens at xcelenergy.com. And we'll make sure those get factored into the agenda for our next conversation. We have these events coming up August 5th, again, 1 o'clock. We're calling that workshop 6B. That's the second half of analysis results that the team will be sharing. And I've also wanted to give you all a heads up on your calendars that August 17th, which is just less than 2 weeks after our next workshop, the utility is planning to produce a draft statement of need and action plan. It may be bulletized, it may be text, but it will have context and material to consider for the statement of need and action plan. We're going to ask that stakeholders please take a moment or some time to review those in advance of the August 26th, 27th workshop in Carlsbad, because that workshop will be the place where we'll have stakeholder discussion about comments, changes, revisions, concerns that you all have about the statement of need and action plan. So we want to give you a heads up on your calendar between the 17th and 26th to please take some time to look at those draft documents. They're key parts of the IRP, but they're not the full IRP report, but they are critical elements that stakeholders are asked to comment upon. So please be alert to that. We hope to see as many as can travel in Carlsbad late August. And then the additional deadline that we have worked on with the utility is by September 4th. Any final written comments from stakeholders on the statement of need and action plan will be due by the 4th and of September. The utility will take those comments into consideration and decide how or if they can address them. And then September 22nd will be our final workshop where the information on all the IRP elements, including the near final statement of need and action plan will be shared. There will not be another opportunity during this process for comment, but it's a courtesy review and information sharing prior to the utilities filing of their IRP in October. And September, we'll also ask you all for feedback on this multi-month process we've been on together to see if you have suggestions for making it more accessible, more or better, or things that should change, or things that should be stayed the same, as the Public Regulation Commission is interested in this process and how it goes forward. So that's what's on the radar screen for the next few months. We wanted to give you a glimpse into that. Kathy or Deb, I don't know if you have anything else you'd want to add. As Justin did mention, if anyone who doesn't already have access to the iManage system to see data and results, and you would wish to have that after completing the confidentiality agreement, those forms are available on the GridWorks website at the top of the page under materials or references. Maybe Deb, somebody can correct me of where that exactly is.
Margie, I think we've got it in the materials under one of the earlier meetings. We can pull it up to the reference materials too, if that'd be easier.
Great. Well, if you need that information, please let us know and we'll make sure you get those forms. And before we close, I would like to turn the final comments over to Justin, Jared, Linda, anyone from the SPS team. Is there anything you would like to add before we close today?
I think Jerry had to step out for a little bit, but what I would just say is I appreciate everybody taking time out of their day to, sit with us, talk with us about this. I think this is an important process. It's obviously very impactful for decisions in both the company and for the state of Mexico, and we appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion openly with everybody. More than happy to continue the conversation outside of this formal engagement, and if you want to send an email to Linda or to Deborah Shields, be more than happy to engage more. So look forward to it. Thanks, Margie, for putting this on for us.
You're welcome, and happy modeling to you.
Thanks.
Just Alex, before we adjourn, I found the presentation for you. There's the link on the load forecasting methodology.
Alex, are you still on? I think we've lost him.
Okay, we can follow up on the side.
Yep, okay, great. I will make sure that we email him that directly. All right, thank you all, and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you again on August 5th for part B of modeling results. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.